A lot of this is just going to be focused on building websites, the tools that you have available. This is going to be another very short lecture like the last one. Not a whole lot to cover. And I don't want to get too deep into detail just because a lot of it is just talking about code syntax, pardon me. So I'm just going to cover what you guys need to know. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is HTML. You've probably seen these 4 letters at the end of a website URL or web page URL rather. This stands for Hypertext Markup Language. We have mentioned this in the past. And this language serves as the skeleton for every single web page you visit. The current version is HTML5, which adds a whole bunch of new features. Well, they're not new anymore. They've been around for about, I want to say, 6 years, something like that. But this tells your web browser how to order and organize everything, where to put it, what sort of text should be displayed, where the line breaks, horizontal bars, and other such things like that are. This is a very basic language. If you want to, dip your toes into the waters of programming, this is a good place to start. It's very easy to get started with, and testing it and seeing the changes as you write is very quick and easy. You just load your HTML file into a web browser and refresh the page every time you save your HTML. Very, very beginner friendly, I would say. But it is a little bit tedious because of the tags. You've got an opening and closing tag for just about everything you put into the page, and you have to remember to do that. It gets repetitive very quickly, but nothing difficult. Next up is CSS. CSS3 is our current version, and this is the Cascade style sheet. Defines how your content looks on the web page. You could define things like color, margins, where something is placed. Is it fixed to the top of the screen or the bottom of the screen? And you can use what are called media queries to make things appear differently on different screens. We'll get to a brief explanation of what I'm talking about with that in a moment. Just know that CSS is your, you could think of it as the paint job to your web page, whereas HTML is the body. Next up, JavaScript and scripting tools. JavaScript, we've mentioned this before. This is a high-level programming language commonly used for web page scripts. This can be things that dynamically change how your web page looks. It can write the HTML on the fly, change things up if necessary. And this is where a lot of specialized libraries are going to come into play. A very popular one that's used is called jQuery, which can be added to a web page to put in HTML on the fly. So you have an empty tag, say a div, which is just a general purpose, this is a place for content kind of HTML tag. And you can use jQuery to say, okay, I want to fill this with information from this text file. And as I update this text file, the web page should change accordingly. And so it's things like that that make JavaScript very powerful, very attractive, and also make it possible to write entire web pages and entire websites in JavaScript. Have it do all the HTML for you instead of creating your HTML files. This is possible. I've heard of it happening. I've never looked into websites that do it very much, but it is definitely possible. You just create a placeholder HTML file for everything and then have the JavaScript fill it in. But of the three, it is the hardest to learn because this is full-on programming with variables and functions and other such things. So learning to do that can take a while. Moving on to actually talking about websites themselves, we have generally two types of sites, either static or dynamic. A static site is going to include information, and that's about it. Very infrequently updated, few to no interactive elements. Pretty much just done in HTML and CSS. You don't see a lot of these nowadays as more and more interactive elements are being introduced into websites, but a good example you could think of would be maybe a wiki. Whereas a dynamic website, these again have interactive elements. They might draw from a database. They might include browser-based games or other such things like that. And these will update a lot more frequently. Places like Amazon are more of a dynamic website, social media especially. Those are just some examples of dynamic sites. And as the slide says, these use server-side scripting to accomplish all of this. We're going to cover one other scripting language later in this lecture. Responsive web design. This is where CSS's media queries come into place, and among other things. So responsive web design, if you've ever been looking at a web page, say you rotate your phone into portrait mode, and now all of a sudden everything is kind of shifted around a little differently. This is a product of responsive design. The web page has been created so that it will adapt to the screen size and orientation for the user and make things just generally nicer. It can also include accessibility. We've mentioned using alt text in our SAM projects. This also applies to websites. So placing captions within images as alt text, very common practice. Just making sure that everything is nice and readable to somebody who needs to use a screen reader, for example. These are all principles of responsive design. And this is a very important aspect of web design, so much so that Free Code Camp has an entire certification track on this. So a whole lot that would be covered if we went into detail. You could do an entire class on responsive design. Moving on to looking at some of the tools that we can use to build websites. We have website builders and CMSs, content management systems. These are these are easier tools to use, more collaborative in nature. A quick note before I move on to the next slide and we compare and contrast these is website builders often include search engine optimization features. And all this means is ways for you to understand how your site is showing up in search engines and how to improve that, giving you, ways to propagate your website better through services such as Google. And so some similarities and differences. Both of these, like I said, are more beginner friendly than the alternatives. These can include some drag and drop interfaces. Templates are often provided. Pardon me. Some examples of website builders include Weebly, which I've seen a few people use. It looks like a decent tool. I've never used either of these kinds of tools, so I can't personally vouch for them. But as you see, you have plenty of options if this is the route you want to go for. Website builders are more for small scale projects such as personal websites, small businesses, whereas CMSs are better suited to larger businesses. But of course, they can serve either purpose. What I personally prefer to use, and what you'll find yourself learning to use more likely if you take any sort of web design coursework, you're either going to see text editors or IDEs. We've already talked about IDEs for programming. The same principles apply in web development. You've got debugging tools. You've got ways to organize your files into a project folder. And of course, we all know what a text editor is. It's just a plain text notepad type of thing. I personally use Notepad++, which is more code focused. You can still definitely use it as a normal notepad type of program, but it's those extra features and also some accessibility options that make Notepad++ a much better fit for me personally. Of course, when you are building a website, you most likely have the intent to publish it unless you're practicing. And there are a few considerations you need to make here. First off, you need a unique name. There are tools you can find online that will allow you to input your website's domain name, and it will search it up, make sure it is available. If someone else is using it, then you're going to have to come up with something else. On a more technical side, you need to consider how much data storage you need. If you're just storing blogs with the occasional image, you may not need very much storage space. But if you're storing games, software, or videos, you may need something bigger. The same thing goes for bandwidth. If you're doing any sort of video streaming through your website, you may need to find a service provider who is going to offer higher bandwidth. And of course, this is going to cost more. So considerations must be made for finding the right balance between, okay, I want the bandwidth that I need, but not going so overboard that I'm paying some insane amount of money for my web server. And of course, this is obvious. You need to be sure that your service provider's operating system is compatible with any software that you might want to put on your website. Otherwise, obviously, it's not going to work. And the last thing it mentions is uptime. Again, this is pretty obvious. You want to go for something that is as high as possible, as close to 100%. You will not find someone who says that their service has a 100% uptime. And if you do, they're lying. Machines go down, power outages happen. There are problems that occur we cannot foresee or prevent. And so anything, I would say over 95, 98%, that would be a good minimum to shoot for. But of course, more is always better. Because if you think about it, a 95% uptime, that's going to be on average 36 hours out of the month that they're not available, which is pretty terrible if I'm being perfectly honest. So, higher than that, like 99.5, something like that, as close to 100 as I've said. All right, managing websites. We have analytical tools that we can use to see who is using our site and how, and this can drive our decision making when we improve or otherwise change our website. Google Analytics is one such tool, and these tools can give you access to quite a bit of information. It can show you the regional demographics of who is accessing your website. It could tell you how many people are coming in, how heavy the traffic is, which may necessitate more bandwidth. And it'll also tell you how people are reaching your site. Is it coming from a search engine? Is it coming from another website like Twitter, or are they just going to it directly? Is it through more word of mouth advertising? that people are finding your website. And it's things like this that we need to know in order to make our site the best that it can be. And so we rely on analytics to do so. Another scripting language, like I said, we'd get to this, is XML. This is extensible markup language. It is designed to look very similar to HTML. However, where HTML defines the structure of a web page, it's effectively the skeleton of a website. XML defines the skeleton of the data stored behind the scenes in a website. So they're very similar in that regard, but one is more visible than the other naturally. And XML relies on user-created tags. So instead of things like the P tag for paragraph or div, like I mentioned earlier, you would actually write your own names for tags as you code and define the data in your XML. And generally, there's going to be two sides to your XML. You have the structure definition, where you outline what each data set is going to look like. So say you define an object as you would with object-oriented programming. But in this case, it's just tags with values stored inside them. And then you have the data itself, where you follow that same structure that you've defined to populate your website with data that your HTML can then pull from to display. And the last thing it wants to talk about is coding and publishing a website. I don't want to get too far into detail on this, but I will go over these steps. We have the first thing you need to do is arrange and configure your hosting, your server, service provider, etc. Make sure that's all taken care of. Oops, excuse me 1 second. Sorry about that. Designing your website. If you remember our last lecture, we talked about designing software. This is where you put in the work to draw up diagrams and charts. And for web design, the same principles apply here. This is where you will define your sitemap, your the software that you're going to use, what sort of services it may provide, or what information will be displayed. Step 3 is we gather or create our graphics and multimedia, pictures, videos, software, all this stuff. Make sure you've got all those taken care of before you get to the real implementation side of things. We begin by coding up our pages in the languages we've discussed today, possibly even more languages. There are other options such as Python. You can integrate Java into a website. SQL, we've talked about that before. That's another option you have. And a popular alternative to JavaScript is C#. You can also use that for your scripting. Then you want to test your site on a bunch of different platforms, a bunch of different resolutions, etc., etc. Make sure it runs as intended for a wide variety of users. Then we publish the site using FTP. This stands for File Transfer Protocol. This is another internet protocol that we use. I'm not going to go too far into detail. The name is pretty self-explanatory. It is used to transmit files across the internet from one system to another. We view and publish, or view the published website on our browser. Again, do the same thing as with step 5, but now instead of looking at it stored locally, we are looking at it from the perspective of a user. And again, making sure everything is there, everything uploaded properly, and it shows up just as it did before. And then finally, we repeat the process anytime we want to change our site in any way. Going back as far, it says step 4 through 7, but you may find yourself going all the way back to step 2 or step 1 in some extreme cases. It all depends on your needs. And then these last 2 slides is just talking about how you would go about coding a website. And we're not going to spend too much time talking about these. Just know that these are all things that you can do with your available tools. You have unordered lists, multimedia links. You can do all of this very easily just with your HTML tags, styling with CSS, and scripting with JavaScript and XML.